Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. It's good to see a few faces that I do know. And I'll try and be really quick here, because I know you guys are on a schedule, but I did want to say that I've actually had opportunities to work with other Rotary International clubs internationally. So I've seen the good work that Rotary International has done. The last time I worked on a project was down in Nicaragua with Rotary International on water and sanitation. And it's really very rewarding, and I think it's as equally rewarding for the people who, like myself, who go down and volunteer in that particular situation, as well as those folks who receive the water and sanitation and solid waste benefits that I was working on. So thank you for doing a good job there. So, how many people here went to Stadium High School? Yes, daughter, somebody from the family. Anybody live in the Stadium District? Okay, so you guys probably are experts here. So feel free to jump in and let me know. In fact, as far as family history goes, we have some of the Carr family, Richard Carr back there, so he could be giving some of this history too. So I had the honor of meeting Mrs. Carr. She was about 100 years old back in the 1960s. So somehow I think it goes back that way. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about the Tacoma Stadium District. Before, I do want to acknowledge the folks that helped me put this together. The Tacoma Stadium District helped sponsor the book. The Tacoma Public Library was of great assistance, as well as the Washington State Historical Society. The archives, in case you don't know, are located right there next to the Stadium Bowl. That used to be the actual museum. The Puyallup tribe was very significant in helping me with this. In fact, in case you didn't know, the original Puyallup tribe main village was located pretty much right where you are today. There's a number of private collections, folks. Private collections help me. I have a couple books if you want to take a look at it. There's some really cool pictures that are not easily available to the general public. And the University of Washington Special Collections and the U.S. Library of Congress was also a big resource, because it just shows how significant not only Tacoma is, but specifically the Tacoma Stadium District. Bill Barsma wrote the foreword for this, and as you know, he was a former mayor of the city, and he's a 1960 graduate of Stadium High School. I also was co-authored with this book with my two daughters. Kelsey, who is at Oregon State University now. She graduated in 2010. I think one of your daughters in the group here was there with her. And then my youngest daughter also helped me, and she's a sophomore at Stadium High School now. To put things in perspective, if you drive along the Schuster Parkway, which many of you have, how many of you guys remember looking out there sort of by the grain terminal when you see those old pilings sitting there? Okay, those for me are an anchor, so I know, okay, up above there is where Stadium Bowl is and where Stadium is, but also those were the actual pilings for the coal bunkers that were first established here when the railroad came in the 1870s. And then if you walk around the Stadium District, and there's an official historic preservation boundary, but what I covered in the book, and I'm not going to cover the whole thing here, obviously, but I pretty much went from the Elks Club up to 10th Street on the other side of their existing Annie-Wright, and I went from I Street down to the waterfront, and that's what I call the Tacoma Stadium District, and that pretty much follows the boundary, maybe a little bit different, but they're pretty much main streets. When you walk around the Stadium District, you often see stairs like this, and I at least think, what are those stairs doing there, and why are they just going to nowhere? And so I've actually, aside from the fact that we have a lot of family history here, I actually learned quite a bit. And the history of this area is just so significant that, you know, it's hard to explain in words and in pictures. So if you go up to Stadium District today on Tacoma Avenue, you see the Rainbows. This is the old, it was a confectionery before, and then across the street from that, of course, is the Harvester. And then there's the Stadium Market today, or the Stadium Thriftway, but that's not what it always used to be. In fact, as you know, originally everything, including where we're at, pretty much were old-growth forests. And the Puyallup tribe was the primary tribe that lived here, and that the Puyallup tribe means people generous, always welcoming to both friends and strangers. And again, where we sit today is where the primary village was for the Puyallup tribe. However, and where Stadium Bowl is today in that gulch was a very significant seasonal fishing village called Hoodhoodgus. And then further down right by where the Sperry Dock is. There's like kind of that open field and that overpass that was called Shabalip, and that was another fishing village that they would, seasonally the salmon would come in through the streams and spawn, and that's where they would spend summertime and then do a lot of drying and preserving of the salmon. This is one of the few pictures I was able to find of the actual tribe. This is located a little bit outside of the stadium district, but it's right along Point Defiance Park, and it's one of the oldest pictures that we have of any of the tribal housing of the Puyallup tribe. And as many of you know, in 1873 there was a famous telegram that came from Mr. Rice and Mr. Ainsworth that was sent to General MacArthur here in Tacoma, and also to our friends up north in Pioneer Square, saying that we've located the terminus on Commencement Bay. Again, it was a huge, many years, the whole Puget Sound area was trying to vie for the location of the terminus for the Northern Pacific Railroad, and it was a huge coup for Tacoma to get it. People around the area were livid, Seattle in particular, but Steilacoom and Olympia, everybody wanted it. And Tacoma was ecstatic until they realized that actually it wasn't going to be an old Tacoma, it was a new Tacoma, where they located the headquarters of the Northern Pacific Railway. But it all worked out, and it did actually then create significant change for the people who were living here, who were dependent upon the natural resources. It wasn't long before the timbermen came in and started removing the old growth forest, because they needed to actually have places for people to live and for the industry to grow. This is a particular viewpoint up where Stadium District is today. How many people who raise your hand have been to the Stadium Bowl or seen Stadium Bowl? Okay, so everybody knows that. Okay, so I just want to be sure. And this actually is located right by where the old Elks Club is. They just recently had clear cut it, and they hadn't started building the new buildings yet. The Northern Pacific Railroad first came to Tacoma in 1873, but that wasn't the main railroad. It just was a little kind of spur from Kalama to Tacoma. But the Northern Pacific Railroad had to do that in order to preserve their rights to the land. And then right around that time there was an economic depression, so that pretty much forestalled things for another 10 years or so. And there was just huge controversy again over why Tacoma was selected. Why wasn't it in Portland? Villard really wanted it there. Of course, Henry Yesler and Maynard and all those guys wanted it up in the Seattle Pioneer Square area. And it was just hugely controversial. And so Charles B. Wright, who was one of the primary presidents of both Northern Pacific Railroad and the Tacoma Land Company, had a real vested interest in ensuring the success of Tacoma. So he was basically our mentor of Tacoma to be sure that we were successful in many ways. And one of the first things he did, in addition to donating the acreage where Wright's Park is today, he also donated or endowed Annie Wright. And Annie Wright is located, this is the original Annie Wright, and probably many of you know that this is where Tacoma's Thriftway, or Stadium Thriftway, is today. So this is looking north on Tacoma Avenue. So if you're going on Tacoma Avenue today, this is where Stadium Thriftway is, and Rainco's would be about here. And if you look at Wright's Park today, and you can see where the pond and everything is, a lot of that has been filled in, and it goes, because that was a gulch, and that's where the natural drainage went from there down through Stadium Bowl into Puget Sound, where all the fresh water for the salmon went. And in 1884, Annie Wright opened a private school for girls. It was very important for Tacoma to establish itself that we were equal or better than any city on the East Coast. And Annie Wright was at this location until the 1920s. Here you can see another view of Annie Wright. Here's the park Wright's Park today. You can see the trees aren't quite grown up. Here's Annie Wright over there, and that's kind of where Titusville is today. And a lot of these houses here are where the church, there's a church over here, and then a lot of that is just parking lots today. So a lot has changed. The trees have grown. One of the very first buildings that was built when the railroad came in was the Blackwell Hotel. The Blackwell Hotel was actually located on the second floor of the Northern Pacific Railroad headquarters, which was located this time in 1873 on the bottom floor. And this is located right on those piles that you see along the waterfront today. That's what was located right on top of it. And I point that out just because so you can, So you can see that here's again the bunkers. Here's the Blackwell Hotel in the Northern Pacific Hotel or headquarters. Here's the coal bunkers, and here's the gulch that now today is Stadium Bowl. If you look up here, here's where Annie Wright is. This is the Stadium Thriftway. There's not a whole lot more here. I believe this is the house of Skookum Smith. He was the one who put the Stampede Pass tunnel through. So he was one of the very first people that came through. He was a very trusted friend of Charles B. Wright. The Blackwells came up from Kalama. They were the first people who were on the, yes. Where here? That actually is a lumber mill. That's where Sperry Dock is. Yeah, I didn't extend it all the way down because I wanted to zoom in. This is 1884. So I do know it's 1884 because of the Annie Wright is there, and there's not a whole lot there. Again, a lot of the development in the area came about in 1888. It took a while for him to cut the trees down and build things and get people here. The Blackwells came up in 1873 when they brought that spur from Kalama. They actually had been running a hotel down in Kalama. And William Blackwell and his dog Blackie and his wife Alice came up, and they were the proprietors, and they ran the Blackwell Hotel. And I'm just focusing on this particular family. There's tons of families, very important, but they just kind of have a thread throughout this that I wanted to highlight a little bit. They had a daughter named Alice who they adopted from New York. She came to Tacoma when she was about 7 years old, and again, here she is with Blackie. And she never married, but she ended up being a school teacher, and she was a school teacher with Tacoma Public Schools for many, many years, and she lived to be 102. And so some of the information I was able to get were from some of her memoirs. And one of the earliest memories she has, is remember, they're one of the first families that came to the Tacoma area, so they were able to choose probably some of the best sites. And the site that a lot of the people seem to migrate to happened to be this bluff over Commencement Bay, which is above the coal. Here's the coal bunkers, here's the gulch where the stadium is, and here's this bluff. And that's the bluff where Stadium High School is today. Well, their family chose that particular piece of property. Excuse me, of all the properties they could choose, this is what they chose to do. And she remembers as a little girl walking up after they would have dinner, and they would walk up and they would clear the property. Their job was to, the men had been up there cutting down the trees, and they had to take all of the slag or the old branches and pile it into piles and burn it. She just remembers how muddy it was and how they smelled the smoke and how dark it was, and this went on for a number of years while they cleared this property. And their family was building a very nice house. It took several years to build the house, and they finally got it built right here where Stadium High School is today, and they were just about to move in about 1890 when the Northern Pacific Railroad said, hey, we've got to have the best place in Tacoma to build a very prestigious hotel. And they said, we want this property. And the Blackwells really didn't want to sell this because they were just getting ready to move in. Can you imagine? This is Blackwell just ready to get moved in, and they want to buy the house. So back in 1890, they were able to sell it to the Northern Pacific Railroad for $86,000, which even back then was quite a bit of money. And so Northern Pacific Railroad got that property from them, and the house wasn't demolished immediately. It was moved across the street. And Hewitt Architectures from Philadelphia, came up with a design of what this new chateau was going to be looking like. Again, they wanted this to be the most prestigious hotel on the West Coast, north of San Francisco, probably north of Los Angeles. They wanted to beat out Seattle, and they wanted to beat out Portland, because this was really an esteemed thing for these people who wanted to be sure this was very, very prominent. This particular picture is that their original rendition sits in the Stadium High School today. And it was to be on 7 floors of hotel rooms. The bottom 2 floors were going to have billiards rooms and Turkish baths and bakeries and winery and reading room and telegram room and all kinds of things. And the things where money was pouring into this. 4 years into the Again, another artist renditions of the Tacoma Tourist Hotel, as it was going to be called, run by the Northern Pacific Railroad for all of the tourists that were going to be coming through here. There was another economic decline in 1893, crash, kind of like we just experienced with the bubble of the, we had just recently or still experiencing. And after $500 million, $500 million, had been put into the, no, that's too much, $500,000 was put into this, but there was a lot of money back then, probably worth that much now. They ran out of money, and so just all the work stopped on the construction of the hotel, and it wasn't complete. They didn't even have the roof and stuff on it. They had a lot of the supplies, but they had to stop. And it stood vacant for about 5 years, waiting for the economic recovery to take place. And pretty much at the end of the 5 years of it standing there, there was a mysterious fire, and that's when a fire took place in about 1898. And if you look, as always, there was big speculation. It happened to be the third big fire during this economic depression in about a month in the North End. Tacoma kind of has this history of these conflagrations when things aren't going so good. The exposition building that was located across from our current Annie Wright today burnt. The woolen mills burnt a couple of weeks later, and then the tourist hotel burned on October 11th. And the gloomy bare walls stood vacant for years. And people were wondering, what are we going to do with this? It just stood as a symbol, there was no money. Kind of like several years later, there was an article in the paper, well, what should we do with this? And you can't read this, but the who's who of the day had their opinion up there. A couple of them thought that it should be a sanitarium. They thought it would be a very good location for that. Others thought they should just let ivory go on the walls, and that was from Roberts. He was one of the superintendents of the Park District. Some of them thought that it should be torn down. Others thought that it would be a really good hospital. And some thought it should be rebuilt as a hotel. Well, at the same time that all this was going on, Tacoma had been continuing to grow, and they were having struggles where they didn't have enough room for a school. The high school was overcrowded, and they didn't have any place to put the kids. So one day, as several of the Mr. Coffee and several other folks were walking from the stadium district to work, and they noticed that they were starting to remove the bricks from the hotel. So they were starting to demolish the hotel. They said, hey, this isn't right. We've got to save this. And so I think this was at 10 o'clock in the morning. They went and they talked to the school board, and they brought in the architect Heath. He took a look at it and said, yeah, we can convert this to a school. So by 2 o'clock that afternoon, the deal was signed, kind of like today, right? And they purchased the property for $36,000. Now, of course, there were lawyers back then, and there was challenge in court saying that this was just overly priced and it was a waste of public money, and this should not have happened. But a few years later, by 1906, the new high school of Tacoma opened, and it was called the Tacoma High School. And it was considered to be the finest building in all of the United States. And of course, the improvements that went into it significantly improved the cost. I'm sure this was a little bit inflated back then, but it was pretty magnificent. And I can say that, my family went to school the very first year. It was my grandpa's sisters went. But it was called Tacoma High School, and they were very, very proud to have this as a high school. And it still is an icon, and I know I take our friends if we come from out of town to see this, because it is it's a beautiful building. But again, there was no stadium. It was just called Tacoma High School. Very prestigious, and it continues to, anybody here when now you guys are also too young. Anybody was here when they had the stadium folks? Oops. Anybody remember the fire escape back here in the library? There was a slide that you could, there was a fire escape slide that apparently kids it went down through the library, and it was made of metal, and so it was quite a fun a fun thing you weren't supposed to go down, but they went down, they threw teachers down, in jest. And then to bother the librarian, apparently a lot of folks, the guys would take the coins and roll it down this slide to just drive the librarian nuts in the library. So. And again, the school continued to change and grow, and it continues to be I know my daughter goes to school now, and it's called the Brown Castle, and every day I drop my little princess off at the Brown Castle and say, have a good day, and these folks come out and they become the leaders for our future, and it's still pretty exciting. And they pass through the senior prom, the graduation ceremonies. Sometimes the ceremonies are at stadium. For a long time, this is back in the 1930s, the stadium, the graduation ceremonies were actually held at the Armory, and now, of course, they're held in the Tacoma Dome. And then, this was not the end of Architect Heath's view of things, and I'm not going to read it to you, but basically he said, every morning he would look and he would say that he saw these old shanties that were located down here in what was originally the fishing area. And then it became an area for widows of old fishermen who had died. And this is the only place they had to live, it was in this gulch, and it became known as Old Woman's Gulch. And he said that this just was incongruent with the vision he had of this castle up there and the tide coming in and out to these shanties and these poor people living there, and that just didn't meet his aesthetic needs. And so he had this vision of creating a bowl. And he was able to create that vision, and that is what Stadium Bowl is today. And after I finish this, I do have an animated, if you have time to stay, you can watch it. You can show some of the construction of the bowl and some of the activities that have gone on. So in 1909, they got the mechanism for funding together and the plan together, and they borrowed the techniques from the mining industry, and they sluiced the hillside down into the bay, from the environmental perspective of mining, into the prime habitat of the salmon. They displaced the poor widows with no place to go. Of course, there was no social equity at the time. But they got their bowl built. And it really is I say that from the environmental side, but it really is a very important public gathering place for Tacoma and has been for over a century. The bowl opened in 1910. This happens to be Troop B, which again was part of the cavalry, the National Guard, that had their horses out of the armory there, and they also were the primary founders of the Woodbrook Hunt Club, which is still functional today. They don't hunt, they chase foxes and hounds with a scented rag on Fort Lewis, and they performed in the opening ceremonies in 1910. I talked to the Hunt Club to see when they had the 2010 reopening their celebration of it, if they'd be willing to have the horses go out and reenact it. And they said, sure they would like to, but their first question is, well, what kind of footing is there? And there was astroturf instead of the sand and dirt and that used to be there, so that eliminated that. But there is still a century worth of history there. And again, there's just been there's been 4 presidents that have come and visited at the Stadium Bowl. Harding, Roosevelt, Wilson, Taft, and Philip Sousa came, and he performed here in the Stadium Bowl in 1910, and he said it was the most acoustically perfect bowl he's ever heard. As far as music goes, playing in the middle. Teddy Roosevelt characterized this as an 8th wonder of the world. I believe it was the first bowl of this type in the United States. Now, I grew up in the area, and I actually thought it was odd that Bellarmine didn't have a bowl like Lincoln or Stadium. I just thought that's how all high school bowl games are played. Little did I know that this was unusual. So here, by this time, you can see here at Stadium, and it's a little bit dark up there. The bowl is there, but I did want to point out that there's a few houses along here that are no longer there today. And if you look at when you look at some of the images, I do want to point out this house here in particular. You can't see it too good, but I have another picture of it. And does anybody know who lived in that house? It was demolished in 1948. It was built in 1888. And again, the people who were here from the very beginning chose this site as far as where they wanted to live. And this house actually was built by Edward Huggins. Does anybody know who Edward Huggins is or was? He was one of the factors of the Hudson Bay Company. He came over from England in 1840 to work at the original Fort Nisqually, which is located over by DuPont. And then when, of course, that was when we were still British at the time, or the controversy of whether it was going to be US or British here. And he stayed through that transition, and then he became a US citizen and decided to stay here. And he decided to build this house right across the street from what then became the Stadium High School and Stadium Bowl. This house was there before actually Stadium High School was there. And there's a picture of him. And then also, if you go to where the parking lot of the current parking lot is, the Stadium High School, there's many different houses there, but this is one of their cooler houses. And this is, pardon me? Yeah, it's been torn down, unfortunately. And this belonged to Herr Anton Huth, who was the proprietor of the Pacific Brewing Company and Tacoma Brewing Company. They held Tacoma malt. Yes?
I remember going to a professional football game in the Stadium Bowl. I think I was like 14 years old, and the crowd, I mean, the place was just full, and I can't remember what football teams that were there. Do you have any record?
I do have, and one of the things here, I know that, of course, University of Washington, I think,
they
were big teams. They were like, Texas A&M pro teams, and I have a little thing that Bill Barsman, he's a sports fanatic, he put together that it actually listed at the end, and so rather than misquote it, it will come up when I finish this in just a couple minutes. But yeah, it was a really big deal. I mean, the bowl was built for, I think officially when it was first built, it had the capacity of 25,000 people. Then in but because the crowds were so huge, it was usually 65,000, overflowing, standing room only. There were places that they weren't supposed to be. It was just really amazing. And I kind of wish I could have been there to see it, because it just looked like a lot of fun, because there was nothing else in town. This was the game. There was no electronics, no Blackberries or texting or that kind of stuff. So this is what was going on. Now, one of the reasons that I think this house and many of the others are no longer there is that, of course, the Prohibition came in, and then they lost their ability to actually get some of their revenue. They did eventually, I think, make some soap, but I think it just was never the same. And then a lot of the folks from the Tacoma Stadium District that were the mover and shakers, not only of Tacoma, but of the Puget Sound and they had long, very strong ties to Washington, D.C. and the East Coast. Well, they decided that they actually liked their leisure time out in Lakewood with the Tacoma Golf and Country Club and the Woodruff Hunt Club, and they all moved kind of lock, stock, and barrel in the 1920s, right before the Depression out there, and then we lost a lot of their very prestigious homes soon thereafter. So again, here's the Annie-Wright, what it used to look like, and then the Stadium District today. Now there's, some of those, like Tully's is located in front there. Yeah, we got 5 minutes. And the Tacoma-Longri Tennis Club used to actually be located right across the street from where the Stadium District Thriftway is today, instead of down there where the old Annie-Wright, where the current Annie-Wright is today. And again, this is, for those of you, I know Mr. Coates is an engineer, that this is in part of the Gulch area, the lower part that they have since filled in, but if you look closely, this is where the used car lot is today. Nelson Bennett's mansion, 40-room house was demolished. It was a restaurant for a while, and today it's 505 Broadway, so it still retains some of its majestic. Yes?
They said they called that Broadway Bankers.
Yeah, Bankers Row. Broadway was C Street, and they called it Bankers Row because that's originally where all the folks went, and then they later kind of migrated up to the stadium area. And these are a couple of the houses, the Griggs and the Hewitt houses, that were demolished in the 30s and 40s. And today we have the Stadium Bowl that we know today. Now I'm going to quickly just show, we'll take questions, but there's a couple things I wanted to actually show here. Let's see if I can figure this out. Not responding. And now. How about reduce? Okay, so there's two little clips. One is the construction actually of the bowl, and then there's actually some with the activities. The second one, the shorter clip, has a list of all the football teams that were there. the wonder of electronics, right? It did work earlier. So while we're waiting, does anybody have any questions?
Where does the Tacoma Hotel fit into the story of the Tacoma Tourist Hotel?
The Tacoma Hotel was located where the Fireman's Park is today, and that was built before the tourist hotel. It was a very elegant hotel. Norfolk Pacific wanted to make this one even more elegant. And